Hey guys, so last week we looked at how the civil rights movement changed the life of African Americans within the United States. Today we are going to look at how the civil rights movement affected another group. We're going to look at how it affected American Indians. So, before we talk about that, we need to look at a couple vocab words. The first word is American Indian. This is a term for the peoples whose ancestors lived in the Western Hemisphere before 1492, aka the year Christopher Columbus arrives. They are also called Native American or First Nations. I say American Indian because that is the term that I have seen most people from this group use for themselves in my research. Um, Native American is also very popular. First Nations is very popular in Canada. Another word we need to look at is tribe. A tribe is a group of people connected by family, tradition, and history. Now, there's also something called a sovereign nation. A sovereign nation is a country not controlled by another country. So, one very important thing to know about American Indian tribes in North America is that they are sovereign nations. So, American Indian tribes are sovereign nations. This means they are not part of the United States. They are not controlled by the United States. They are older than the United States and are their own independent countries, not controlled by the United States. I'm going to say this again and then I'm going to ask the question. American Indian tribes are sovereign nations. This means that they are their own countries that are not controlled by the United States. What do I mean when I say American Indian tribes are sovereign nations? Okay, good. So now we're going to get back into the history. So, since the first US administration, since George Washington was the president, the United States government had broken treaties with American Indian nations. So back then the US wasn't as powerful as we were today. So we had to make deals with these other American Indian nations that we shared the land with. And George Washington kept breaking those deals again and again and again. He would promise, oh, we won't send settlers to your land. Then he would just send settlers there anyway. How do you think American Indian nations felt about George Washington breaking the treaties? So, this kept going for hundreds of years. And in the 1960s, young people from American Indian nations across the continent joined together in the Red Power movement. I say across the continent and not across the country because people from Canada and Mexico also joined this movement. Now, the movement's goal included celebrating Native culture. So before this, most Native Americans were forced to learn to speak English, to cut their hair, and to act and dress like white people. And at this time, a major push was made for American Indians to start dressing in ways and acting in ways that they felt honored their ancestors and their tribes. There was also a major push for tribal autonomy and the restoration of treaty rights. So remember, way back in the beginning, we said that American Indian tribes are sovereign nations. So they are supposed to be as free and as independent as the United States. They're not supposed to be controlled by the United States. But in real life, the United States did not show them the respect they deserved. They told American Indian nations what they had to do and how they had to act. So at this time, those nations made a push to have their treaty rights restored and to get increased autonomy. So they wanted to be able to act like they truly were independent sovereign nations. Does that sound fair to you? Why or why not? So, one group took it past talking. Starting in 1969, a group called Indians of All Tribes, so these were people from different tribes across the United States, went to an island called Alcatraz in San Francisco Bay. That island used to have a big prison on it, but it had been abandoned for a while. And they occupied the island for 19 months. So they took over the island and set up a place to live there. What they said was happening was they were protesting the broken treaties between American Indian nations and the United States. They said, "You promised us land and treaties, you promised us respect. Since you obviously won't give us the land or respect on your own, we're just going to go and take it." And you can see they did pretty well with the old prison. Up top, you can see them playing basketball, and on the bottom, you can see them eating a meal together. Now, the goal with this, part of it was to take back the land, but part of it also was to raise awareness across the country of what was going on. And they actually got people's attention. As the months passed, Richard Nixon, sent representatives to negotiate with the Indians of all tribes. Now you can see that in the picture here. This is the guy that Richard Nixon sent. I believe his name was Robert Robinson, and the negotiations eventually broke down. But after all the protesters went home, they continued to fight. And in 1975, Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination and Educational Assistance Act. This act promised an increase in tribal self-rule and a renewed commitment to sovereignty. So it promised that the US government, represented by Richard Nixon here, would show the proper respect to American Indian tribes and allow them to run their own things like the independent countries they are supposed to be. This law, do you think it is an example of radical action, coalition building, or legal action? Why? What about the Alcatraz occupation? Is taking over the island of Alcatraz an example of radical action, coalition building, legal action, or some combination? Why? All right, guys, that's it for today. I'll talk to you later. Have a good afternoon.